Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this month's History at Home presentation. We are going to be talking about historic mansions of Licking County, and I'll go ahead and advance the slide into our presentation just to get you all acquainted. If you haven't familiarized yourself with the Zoom controls, please take a moment to do that. I did send everyone a message, which hopefully you have seen. It should show up in your chat box area, chat bubble. You can use that to ask me any questions if you have any throughout the presentation. If you think of something or something that I say sparks a question, you're welcome to type that question in the chat box and I will be able to see it. If I can, I will address your question as best as I am able to in the moment. But if not, I will go through at the end and answer any questions. So if you ask something or if you have a comment and I don't get to it, don't worry, I will do my best to go back through at the end of the presentation and take care of anything that was not answered in the presentation. So I am going to turn off my video. Also, I should say, if you haven't been to, or if you haven't been involved in one of our Zoom presentations yet, thank you so much for joining. My name is Corey Stutz, and I'm the museum curator at The Works. I pretty much think about local history all the time, so it's super exciting to me that all of you are interested in this topic as much as I am. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. My contact information will also be at the end of the presentation. Later, you're welcome to give me a phone call or send me an email, and I can help you with your question. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off just so that my picture is out of the way, and you can focus on the presentation. And we'll go ahead and get started. So if you drive around Licking County, you're going to know, or you're going to notice that there are quite a few houses that are pretty historic and quite big. The term mansion is a little bit subjective as to what constitutes a mansion or not. I mean, really, even the actual definition of it is sort of up in the air. So we're talking about historic homes. Some of them may be quite large and sort of might be what you think of as a mansion. Others are more modest, but these are all very historic homes. So the first one here, I like to start off with a couple that most of us are probably familiar with. However, this is the original location of this home. This is the Sherwood Davidson house, and it is one of the oldest homes within Newark. The date of its construction has been a little tossed around, but it's somewhere between around 1815 and 1825. It's a pretty classic federal style house. Originally, it was on the location where it is in this picture, which is the corner of 3rd and Church. Nowadays, Park National Bank sits in this spot. This house is pretty well known. And even before it was moved from this location, it was quite well known as well, maybe not for good reasons. As you can see in this picture, it was sort of overgrown and run down. Only 2 families really had owned it and lived there. And the Davidson family lived in the home for, I think, over 100 years. And by the 1940s, it was in pretty bad shape and was going to be torn down. However, so this was just a couple of doors down from Carol's department store. And actually the person who sort of helped save it was Mr. Lazarus. I can't remember his first name. I think maybe it was Frank Lazarus, but he had, so as in Lazarus department store. And he funded actually the house to be saved. So you can see what it looked like, pretty scary, very obscured of its details. This is a postcard. I'm not exactly sure from when exactly, but it's probably a couple of decades before the house actually ended up being moved in the 1940s. So here we have a picture, and I apologize, some of these pictures are going to be a little bit blurry. This is a pretty small photo, so I had to enlarge it a little bit. But you can see the house was lifted up. I believe the year was 1947. And it was actually moved to its location where it is now, rather than just being demolished in order to put Park National Bank there. It was lifted and moved. The people of the time recognized that it was significant historic value and architectural value, and it was gifted to the newly formed Licking County Historical Society, and they moved it to its current location, which is in Veterans Park on 6th Street. So nowadays you can go and visit, and it is a museum where you can go in. And it actually was lifted again off of its foundations not that long ago, just around 15 years ago, I believe. 2006, I want to say, was the year. And it was lifted up for a pretty extensive renovation. They put a new foundation, new HVAC, pretty much new everything. So this house has gotten around, literally, had quite a bit done to it, but it is one of Newark's oldest homes, possibly its second oldest home. Gets a little fuzzy to know exactly what's the oldest, but it is definitely one of the oldest, one that's worth mentioning. Its neighbor is also worth mentioning, and here it is in its original location. This is a photo of the Buckingham House, which again is now located directly next to the Sherwood Davidson House in Veterans Park. And when they were in their original locations, they were neighbors as well. This was just a few doors north on 3rd Street. This was on the other side of Carol's department store, which is now just a location of a parking lot where this house was. This home was a little bit younger than the Sherwood Davidson house, but not by much. This was built in 1835. It was originally built by Daniel Duncan, but the home is called the Buckingham House, which was named after Jerome Buckingham. And he was a really well-known local citizen. He was a judge. He was also president of First National Bank of Newark. So he was a really well-known person. Supposedly, there have been quite a few famous guests who stayed in the house, including Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes, President James Garfield, as well as General Sheridan and General Sherman, who were both Civil War generals. And it's contended, but believed possibly, that Ulysses S. Grant was also a guest in the house. So this was quite an important part of Newark society. Much like the Sherwood Davidson house, this home was also moved. And here's a really great picture. You can see it moving down 3rd Street. You can kind of see, if you look to the right, you can see some wood and boards, and that's where the house has exited its original location. Supposedly, a few things went wrong during this move. I think one of the trucks broke an axle. There were some other disasters that happened. They actually had to cut the house in half in order to be able to fit it, and then they built it, sort of put it back together when they relocated it. This building took a little bit longer before it became open to the public. They renovated it, turned it into more of a meeting house. So the first floor is more open if you've ever been to an event there. And I believe this opened in the 1950s to the public. It was moved in 1954. So then in the later 1950s, it was moved. The Sherwood Davidson house, in contrast, was moved in 1947. That one opened to the public during the sesquicentennial year for Newark in 1952. And here it is in its current location, also in Veterans Park. Now, again, these houses, I guess I would call this a mansion. It's maybe not humongous, but it's definitely grand. And I think its importance, both historically and currently, sort of let it be designated as that. Like I said, we'll bend the rules on what we count as a mansion or not. We all sort of have our own definitions. I think that's a more exciting word than house, though. Now this one looks somewhat familiar, looks similar to the house that we just saw. However, this is a different house. It's sort of important to say that those two homes were from the same era. This house was also built in the 1830s. And during the 1830s to 1840s, we see a lot of Greek Revival architecture, which is the style that this is, in Newark and in Licking County. Some other famous Greek Revival buildings, you might be familiar with the Robbins Hunter Museum, which is in the Avery Downer House, and also St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Granville. Those were both built in the 1840s and there are quite a few other Greek Revival buildings in Newark that are from that time period, maybe even into the 1850s. And it was a popular style. And you can really see a lot of the same things reflected from the Buckingham House as well as in this house. This house, however, is, we call it the Dr. Cooper House. It's located on Hudson Avenue on the corner of Hudson and Wyoming. And this house is still there, still standing. It's in its original location and has quite a history to it. I see somebody has their hand raised. Christopher, did you, if you have a question, you're more than welcome to type it in the chat box. You should be able to see a chat bubble, and I'd be happy to answer it if you did have a question. So this house located on Hudson Avenue, it's called the Dr. Cooper House, and it's called that for specifically Dr. Cooper. And Dr. Cooper's got quite an interesting story. He lived here in Newark during a pretty tumultuous time, not just in the city, but really in the country. And there were a couple of waves of cholera outbreaks. Excuse me, one was pretty horrible in 1848. During that time, several people from the city fled to the country surrounding. Pretty much all of the doctors, anyone with the means to leave, did. If you know anything about cholera, you know that it's incredibly contagious and it spreads through contaminated water. And it's pretty easy to contaminate the water. If there is someone with cholera and they're, you think back then, the sort of sanitary methods that we have now did not exist. Water wasn't always clean and filtered, and it was just much more difficult to keep disease at bay back then. The outbreak actually started on South Fifth Street, or at least that was where it was first noticed. Someone had noticed that a house where a bunch of men who were in town just for work, they had noticed that people had been sick, and all of a sudden people started dying in this house. And someone went to check by, and I think there were something like 5 men or so that had died in this house, and they had died of cholera. And so at that point, they knew that it was pretty serious. So a lot of people, as I said, started fleeing the city. But Dr. Cooper stayed behind. He recognized that people were going to need health care, and they were going to need somebody to take care of them. And as altruistic as that was, unfortunately, that didn't fare too well for Dr. Cooper. He ended up getting cholera, and his entire family ended up getting cholera. There was one person in his household who did not die from cholera, and that was a young lady who they employed to help with some housework. I believe she got it, but she didn't end up dying from it. But Dr. Cooper, his wife and children, all unfortunately ended up passing away, which they might not have done had they left the city, but it's hard to know how many people he could have prevented from dying from cholera at that point in time. So stories like that are just examples of, personally, to take a side note, why I get so into local history, because those cholera outbreaks were happening all over the place in the country. And when we study things that happened nationally or even globally, but we study them from a local perspective, we understand how people were dealing with those things locally in the town where we live, living in houses that we can still go see. I think that really makes it a lot more personal to us and really connects us to the past quite a bit. So a story like this talks about something that was really very tragic, and we can still go and see the house where this man who did something heroic for his city lived and worked, and unfortunately ended up dying because of it. This house is still there. This is an older photo of it from Google. It's actually looks a little bit different now. There's been some new paint on some of the wood pieces. That's only one part of this house's story, though. Some of you might be familiar with something else that happened. And this happened in 1942, September of 1942. There was actually a plane crash, a B-25 bomber plane, which was flying from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, had run into some rough weather and ended up crashing. And the plane crashed into the corner of Hudson Avenue in Wyoming. So the photo on your left is actually the house we were just talking about. You can see the smoke billowing out of the attic window. Actually, the right column, there should be a column there on the right corner, which is gone in this photo. It was destroyed. Really, the house that took the brunt of it, though, was on the opposite corner. You can see the photo on the right, some damage to that house, as well as the corner after it was repaired. Now, both of these buildings are still standing. They weren't completely leveled by this, as you would think. This was definitely a tragedy as well. Several people did die, including the two men on the plane, someone in the house, a lady who was walking home from Carol's department store, who was killed on the sidewalk. I think a total of 5 people died in this tragedy, and you can still see, if you look really closely, you can still see some scars from this incident. Moving on, we'll move to our next house, and I will just sort of say that we have quite a bit to get through. I am really enthusiastic about this topic, so I have a hard time not including things that I want to talk about. So there's a lot of houses in this presentation. So I'll do my best to get through everything without making this really, really long. But if I do exclude any information, or if you want to know more about a house, please feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, I'll have my contact information at the end. And you're very welcome to send me an email or give me a phone call. Also, there are a lot of other houses that I couldn't include because of time, and quite a few wonderful houses. So if there's any other homes that you have questions about, I think I should also probably do another presentation at some point with homes that I couldn't include in this one. So that will be something to watch out for. And someone asked a question. They were thinking that there were 5 people on the plane. That there could have been. I'm not exactly off the top of my head sure how many there were. At one point in time, I had done a lot more research on this, and I don't have those notes in front of me to remember for sure. But I do remember that I think that there were at least 2 men on the plane that died. Some of them, or at least one of them, tried to eject. But there's a lot of that story has been really well documented. So there's a lot out there. There's a lot of great resources at the library too. They have a file on it, and you can really just keep digging and find so much. It really is a really tragic event that happened, and it's shocking to think that it happened here in New York. All right, but getting back to the presentation, this is the Upham Wright House. It's located at 342 Granville Street in Newark. This house sits in front of Newark High School. So if you're familiar, this is the one that's in front of where the high school sits. This home was built between 1849 and 1850 by a man named George Upham. It was lived in for quite a long time by the Wright House. Again, this is called the Upham Wright House. It was lived in by the Wright family for over 100 years. One of the most famous residents of the home was Mary Sherwood Wright Jones, and she was a nationally known illustrator. She illustrated a lot of children's books, as well as other things. She didn't do just children's books, but she's a really well-known illustrator. It remained in the family through most of the 20th century, and had gone into the family originally when it was purchased by Virgil Wright. The Wright family was also connected to Jerome Buckingham, who I mentioned earlier, because they were both involved with the First National Bank. So there's a little connection between this house and one of them that we had just seen. The style of this house is what's called a Downing cottage. And that's because it drew its inspiration from the designs of A.J. Downing. And he was actually an English landscape architect, but he was incredibly influential in mid-19th century architecture. He created a few different books that had architectural designs that were meant to evoke nature and were meant to complement nature rather than detract from it. As I said, he was a landscape architect, so a home's natural qualities were very important to him. Now, these homes go by the name of Cottage, and that's sort of a misnomer from what we think of as a typical cottage. He called these cottages or country houses, country cottages, but many of them are quite huge. And so think of cottage in more maybe of a romantic sense than a literal sense. However, you can see on either side, the left and the right, these are actually pages from one of his books. And there's a pretty much exact rendering of this house in his book. So again, these designs were taken from his book. It wasn't him directly acting as the architect or the builder, but they were taken from his book. Here's a picture of it today. It looks virtually identical to how it's ever looked. It really is a gorgeous, gorgeous house, and it's an architectural treasure, really. We have a few other Downing cottages. The overall style of this is Gothic Revival, which was popular in the area in the mid-19th century. And we have other examples, which we'll talk about, but this one is immaculate and is quite an important local piece of architecture. One of the other well-known Downing cottages that we have in the area is this one. This is called Oakwood. And actually, this is the sketch that inspired Oakwood, but this we'll talk about. Oakwood is nowadays known as the Penny Mansion. And this is actually a design that was drawn by A.J. Davis, who was the illustrator for Downing. And they worked together. Davis was a watercolorist, and he illustrated a lot of Downing's designs, but Davis did some of his own designs as well, but still in the same style. So this is one of those. This house was actually the only one that was made from that or inspired by that design. And as you can see, it's pretty similar. This house is actually made of brick, but it's covered in what's called buttermilk stucco. So they used the buttermilk actually as a binder for the stucco. It is located on the east end of Newark. Now it's on Penny Avenue, but originally it would have been on Cedar Street or 79 North. So this house was built around the same time as the last one, 1849 to 1851. Another Downing style house or Downing cottage. This one was built by George Washington Penny. And it was built as a gift for his wife, Romina, and their children. It was originally part of a 200-acre farm. So Penny was a very influential man. He obviously was an agriculturalist. He had his hands in quite a few different business dealings, which eventually included railroads and agriculture, real estate, that kind of thing. After the Civil War, though, they sort of fell on hard times. They ended up having to sell off quite a bit of their land. A large portion of their land was sold to the Heisey Company, where they ended up building their factories. Here's a picture of the house today. It has lost some of its ornamentation, but it still retains a lot of its original design and its character. You can still see quite a few of the original Gothic details. And here's a picture of the family. These are, in the back is Mr. Penny with his children, and I assume a couple of grandchildren sitting in front of him, and they are in front of the house. And from this map, you can see just a portion of the original property. As I said, they had 200 acres. And part of what sort of caused some of their financial decline was this, as Newark continued to grow, their property started to become annexed into the city of Newark, and that affected their property taxes. So some of their business dealings were already struggling, and then adding on the additional taxes, that really started to become a problem for them. So they were selling off a lot of their land. Now it's pretty much all been developed, and there are houses built all over it. In the end, the house was lived in by their daughter Ermina. The family occupied it until around 1900, But Ermina was the last family member to live there, and she ended up having to sell off the house. However, she still needed somewhere to live. So I think it was probably a developer who purchased the house, but she had to rent back a room in the house to be able to stay. And sadly, she had to also rent back her own belongings because the house sold with everything. So it was really sort of a sad end for the family that was once one of Newark's really great, well-to-do families. Another house in the area, and which would have been contemporary to the Pennies, this is Rose Hill. This was the home of the Robbins family. This is located just a little bit north of the Penny Mansion. And there's a funny story between Rose Hill and Oakwood. And Oakwood is said to have had the first bathtub in Licking County, but the family that lived in Rose Hill were able to take the first indoor bath. And that's because while these houses were built around the same time, and while the bathtub or the plumbers were at Oakwood to install the bathtub, the residents of Rose Hill decided, well, we should go ahead and get a bathtub as well, since they're here. So they finished at Oakwood, went to Rose Hill, started a bathtub there. Unfortunately, there were issues with leaks in the one in Oakwood, so it wasn't actually functional. So the plumbers finished up the bathtub at Rose Hill and then went back to Oakwood, but Rose Hill's bathtub was just fine. So the people in Rose Hill were actually able to take a bath first. Now, I don't know, that could be completely true. That could be a tall tale, but that's a story that's been passed down, and I think it's pretty entertaining, sort of a funny thing. Now, this house was the home, if anyone, so we talked about earlier the Robbins Hunter Museum, briefly mentioned it. The name Robbins Hunter is pretty well known around Licking County. Robbins Hunter Jr. was a very well-known citizen. His father, Robbins Hunter, was a local judge and mayor and was very well known as well. This was the home of, I think, Robbins Hunter's grandparents, his mother's family. And if we look at these two, we can see the home of the Robbins family as well as the home of the Hunter family. The Hunters lived on Buena Vista, very close to Rose Hill. Their house has since been demolished as well as the one on the right. Moving on to another very well-known house. This is one that is no longer with us. This presentation will be a mix of homes that are still standing and some that have been demolished. This red box shows on the map the outline of the Berkey Mansion. Now, unfortunately, we don't have really any great pictures of this house, which is really sad because I would love to see pictures of it. But this was the home of James L. Berkey, and it was originally built in the 1850s on the corner of East Main and Buena Vista. Berkey was a really well-off man. He was a businessman in the purest sense in that he not only excelled at one business, but he excelled at many. He quickly immersed himself in the local economy upon moving here. He had a dry goods store. He was really instrumental in bringing the railroad to Newark. He helped finance that. And he helped to also pioneer the distillation of petroleum from coal. So he learned that he could build one business to help another one succeed. And the railroad helped with his other business ventures. And then eventually he found ways to help sustain the railroad. So as he got more and more into railroad investing, he continued to do that in other places in the country as well. Eventually, he ended up moving west. Some of his business here in Newark was not doing so well. So as he was investing in other railroads, he ended up moving out west. Unfortunately, his story came to a sad end because he felt that he was going to go bankrupt. He thought that one of his railroads was failing. He ended up taking his own life. But the really tragic thing is that that wasn't the case at all. It wasn't failing. So he, just out of a misunderstanding, thought that he was financially ruined. He had been there before, sort of fallen on rougher times. And so he thought that was happening again. His wife, who was his second wife at the time, actually came back to Newark with their child. She was really socially involved in the city. The house, however, was a 3-story Italianate house with a 3rd floor ballroom, rumored even back then to be haunted. According to some guests, the 3rd floor was haunted. According to other guests, there was a photo of Berkey's first wife that was in one of the rooms, and she was supposedly the house. Story goes that when you would walk into the whichever parlor had her painting in it, if you would turn your back on it, the painting would be flipped around. And this was because she was upset that the new wife was in the house. Now, either that could have been the ghost of the former Mrs. Berkey, or that could be the second Mrs. Berkey mad at having to look at the picture of the previous wife. It's definitely hard to say, but it's interesting nonetheless. Here we can see a drawing from a map. So I don't know how accurate this is to the actual appearance of the house, but you can kind of get some kind of view of it. Looks like there's a cupola on the top. Looks like a pretty large grand house. I believe it sat on about 70 acres. At one point in time, there was discussion to put a hospital on this site, but they felt that it was too close to the water, too swampy, and would therefore be unhealthy for everyone. After Mr. Berkey passed away, the house was lived in by a couple of different families. There was a family by the last name of Blood who lived in the house. William Nolan Fulton also lived in the house, and we'll talk about him later. He lived in the house until it was eventually purchased by real estate developers in the 1890s. It was developed in 1891. The house was demolished. The land was sold off into lots. So this house was really only around for about 40 years. Not very long, and really unfortunate because Florence King, who was a Newark socialite in the late 19th century and wrote about a lot of things that she remembered really throughout her life, but wrote a series of articles in the 1930s. She remembered this house and talked about it as really one of Newark's grandest homes. And so it's pretty sad that we don't have it here, since you can tell sort of by some of the stuff that it's pretty special. Someone asked, how many are haunted now? That's a great question. I have no idea. That's something that's very difficult to find out, even stories that people have told of haunted houses. I have done a couple of presentations. I did one actually that was on tales of Newark. So there are a couple of ghostish stories in that. You can check out on our YouTube channel. But that's something I always try to collect articles. I think it's interesting. Some of these houses that we've already talked about in this presentation have ghost stories associated with them as well. So if you have questions about any of that kind of stuff, you can feel free to ask me through email or something, and I can send you the resources that I have. Again, that's also a very subjective topic to talk about. So you just have to kind of take your own interpretation with it. This gives a better idea of some of the land surrounding the Berkey Mansion. So if you look, hopefully you can see my cursor. You can see the name here, James Berkey. So here's East Main Street. Here's where the house was. So the Berkey property extended all up here along the river. Of course, now that's pretty much all been developed. So the next house is one that's also been lost to time. This is showing Spring Hill. So where we're looking, this is the intersection of 5 Points, where Locust, 5th Street, and Granville come together. Spring Hill was another Italianate style house. It's a pretty common architectural style around here. You can see this is a really great photo of it showing its cupola. It was originally built in the 1860s by Hezekiah Sprague, and the Sprague family was well known in Newark. There were a few of them. Famous, his brother was a famous attorney, or locally famous, locally well known. Sprague, however, was in the jewelry business, and so he was pretty successful. And he built this home on a hill overlooking downtown Newark. His house was famous because it was, a lot of these homes were sites of social activity. And so a lot of people, their doors would be open to guests, and people would be able to come in and see them during parties or for weddings. But he also really wanted this house to be available for the betterment of society. And he thought that he could do that through plants and through horticulture. So he actually had a very large greenhouse that he built, and it was full of a variety of roses, which at the time, roses don't, we do have wild roses here, and there are a couple of varieties that naturally grow well. But by and large, roses needed to be hybridized in order to really grow well in our climate here in Ohio. So before that had happened, he had a variety of all different types of roses in his greenhouse, which it became really well known for. This conservatory was said to be perfumed with the scent of roses in the air, and it was really a sight to see. And he wanted, he allowed people to visit and look at it. And so there are a lot of really interesting stories. There was an article that was written in the Advocate describing the experience, and that person used a lot of very flowery language, pun intended, but it was quite a descriptive article. Later, the house was purchased by William Nolan Fulton, who I had mentioned before. The Fulton family were pretty important in Newark. I believe he was the county treasurer. But they had a daughter whose wedding was the social event of the season. And there's another really great article that describes that talks about the carriages pulling up and the ladies getting out, describes the dresses in detail and what the bride wore, where the wedding took place. Thought it was very interesting. They had an evening wedding by candlelight. So I'm sure that was quite a sight to see. This house, here's a picture of the Fultons, William and his wife. And before we go back, this house was actually sort of eclipsed by something that was built in front of it. And I guess I didn't include a picture in this since we're going on to something else, but it's First United Methodist, which I think is called the First Church now. The Methodist Church downtown on the corner was built essentially in front of Spring Hill in 1909. And they used the house actually as a rectory and I think as administrative offices later. And eventually the house was torn down in 1966. So it stood for around 100 years and was torn down then. Next, we're going to talk about a couple of houses that are on this corner of 4th Street and West Church. You can see the first one on the top, and then there's one in the middle. These are photos of them. So the one on the left is the home of the Smythe family. Locally, it was dubbed Capitol Hill because they thought that it looked sort of like a government building. And the one closer in the foreground on the right is now known as Stacelwood. The Smythe family, which I have in here, is the location of those today. So just to give you some perspective, so sort of did my best to take it from the same angle. This is the Smythe home from a different view. The Smythe family were really well known. George Smythe was a well-known attorney in Newark. And this, by Florence King's account, this was the social center of Newark in the 1850s and 1860s. And the Smythes had, I believe, 4 daughters, and they were all very well known. Though the wife was said to be one of the sort of classiest women in Newark. And in fact, Mr. Smythe bought her the first fully enclosed carriage in Newark so that she could ride around in style and privacy. The house was said to be filled with music and singing, as the daughters were involved in playing the piano, and they sang operettas. And in fact, it's said that the youngest daughter died at the piano while playing and singing. So that sounds like a very dramatic sort of Victorian macabre story, but very interesting one nonetheless. Now, I do want to point out, if you notice, this house sits quite up on a hill. and it's surrounded by a retaining wall. We can go back a couple of slides. You can notice the people standing there a lot too. It's important to point that out because downtown Newark now has been changed quite a bit, and naturally it was dotted with bluffs and hills. It was not flat like it is now. So the house was quite a few feet higher than street level. And obviously that was all flattened. As you can see now, there are no hills to be seen. So these homes, both of them had to make way for progress, and that was the construction of the Union Block, which is a building where 31 West is now. And you can see that building there, it's on the corner. The Arcade building, which is the one in the center, this one came a little bit later, but this building is the one that was the cause of those homes' demolition. This building was built in 1903. So they started construction, I think actually in 1902, and that's when they would have cleared the land. Unfortunately, this home, the Smythe home, was completely lost. But the other one was moved. So here it is more recently. It's located on Hickman Road now, north of Hanover. It was completely disassembled and then it was rebuilt in its current location. So it's a gorgeous house. It is still there, still looks wonderful. Some of the details have changed. If we go back, you can see here's the original, the porch looked like. So nowadays, fast forward a little bit, the porch is brick. It does still have some of its decorative elements. Again, this house is called Stachelwood, and I believe that was a combination of two last names of the family. Not the family that lived in it while it was in downtown. That family was actually called Perry Rank. Well, the man's name was Perry Rank. The last name was Rank. And he owned livery stables behind and around the house. Some of those stables, actually, they were brick stables, and they were actually used, a portion of the wall from those stables was used to build the arcade theater that was attached to the arcade. So if you checked out one of my last presentations about theaters, I think I mentioned that, but you will have heard about the arcade theater. So we're really lucky that this house wasn't completely demolished, and still see it today. And I am going to try to start getting through these a little bit quicker. I'm trying to be aware of time. Here we have a drawing of Myrtle Hall, and this is a very elusive house for quite a few reasons, but this was built on Hudson Avenue, just north of Log Pond Run, which now runs underneath Hudson Avenue. It was built by Israel Dilley, who was a really well-known early citizen of Newark. And here's a photo of him, or a painting rather, not a photo. But it was later lived in by Lewis Evans, who the house was really connected to him very well. He lived there for quite a long time, excuse me. And so he was largely associated with the house. Lewis Evans was superintendent of the Ohio Canal, appointed in 1850. He was involved in local government. He was a really well-known person. He also was in the state senate. So he was well-known, pretty important in the area. The house originally was at what was the end of Hudson Avenue. So here is a map. The yellow line, to give you some context, the yellow line is Locust Street. The blue line is along Hudson Avenue. And the red box outlines the property surrounding Myrtle Hall. When Israel Dilley had built it, the original property, I think, was covered with myrtle flowers. And so that lent its name. And he wanted the house to be thought of as sort of a public park, which seemed to have been a very common idea in that time period. So it was lovely landscaped with lovely trees. Rumor has it that he brought the tree of heaven to the area and planted it, which, if you're familiar with what the tree of heaven is, that was no favor that he did to us. Very, very invasive species. But he had this house really well landscaped and wanted it to be pride of place in Newark. It originally sat on the west side of Hudson Avenue, sort of up on a hill. And Log Pond Run, if we go back a couple of slides, ran in front of it. You can see from this illustration. This is from the 1875 Atlas in Newark. And Hudson Avenue sort of just ended at the house. Lewis Evans died in 1897. And by that point in time, Newark had grown quite a bit. And this was now very, very prime real estate. The house ended up getting purchased by landscape or developers, real estate developers, and they purchased the property as well. They started to develop the land into lots. And eventually the house got in the way. This is a photo which I recently discovered. It was in a collection of slides that we have at the works, and it was just labeled Hudson Avenue. So it wasn't very conspicuous, but when I saw it, I sort of the light bulb went off because I had never seen a picture of Myrtle Hall before. So I posted this to a Facebook history group, and there was quite a lively discussion about whether it was or wasn't Myrtle Hall. But in my professional opinion, and some of the opinion of some of my peers, this has to be a photo of Myrtle Hall. It's interesting because this is a photo of it in its original spot before it had been moved. So the house was moved. The land was graded and flattened a little bit. There is still somewhat of a hill that goes up to Elmwood, but the land was changed and it was divided into lots and houses were built. The house was moved across the street. And here you can see in this map, I think this is from 1905, it was moved to the east side of Hudson Avenue, just north of Log Pond Run. So originally it had set sort of across the street from where it is in this map. You can see it's labeled Myrtle Hall Hotel. It had become a boarding house and a rooming house, and it operated as that for quite a while until it was eventually torn down. And I tracked down when it was torn down. It was, I believe, in the 1960s, actually, was when the building was finally demolished. Now, this is what it's got. Some apartment buildings were built there in its place. So unfortunately, that one has been lost. Here's another one that has been lost. This is called the Castle for obvious reasons. This was built by Mayor Gibson Atherton. It was on the corner of 2nd Street and East Church in the late 1860s. This was billed as Newark's only 4-story house, at least at the time. So he had been inspired by homes that he saw in Washington, D.C. He was not only a mayor of Newark, but he was also a member of Congress. He served in Congress from 1878 to 1880, but he was a mayor of Newark from 1860 to 1863. But he was quite an important guy. So in his travels, he had been around and he was inspired by these houses, and he built this one. It was built out of a really unusual color of brick. And you can sort of see, this is a colorized postcard from a colorized photo. But one of the things that people remembered about it was that it was actually sort of a purplish color of brick. The house wasn't very well loved by Atherton's wife. She thought that it was a little bit inconvenient. I believe that the kitchen and the dining room were on separate levels, which is fine if you have a staff, but sort of annoying if you don't have a staff. And so that leads to a lot of problems. And so she didn't really love it. So they ended up building another house on Hudson Avenue. And this home passed into the hands of a few different people. After the Athertons, it became the home of James Lingefeller, later owned by Claude Davis, Dr. Victor Turner, and finally it was owned by Cosmo Investors. Unfortunately, in 1952, the decision was made to demolish the house. It had suffered some fire damage, and apparently parking lot space was very needed at the time. So as is the case with most of our historic houses, it fell away to become a parking lot. This is a real shame because this is really one of the only style of this house that was in Newark, quite different for anything around, and really a really interesting home. Now, I had mentioned the Athertons moved. This is the house that they lived in after. It was located on Hudson Avenue. It is no longer there. This was in the path of 16. Something that this house was really well known for, though, were these two lion statues. And this is a really grainy photo taken from an old book, but Mrs. Atherton was inspired by the lions outside of the New York Public Library, and she wanted a set of her own. However, the story goes that she was dissatisfied with these, and I know that that seems like a running theme. I'm not sure whether that was just her character or if she's getting sort of an unfair portrayal by the stories that people told about her. But she wasn't happy with these lions because they gave her two lions and she wanted one lion and one lioness, but she never got the lioness. So these lions, though, made this house somewhat of a local landmark, and kids would play on them. They were really well known as the house with lions. Unfortunately, though, this one did come down to make way for the construction of 16. This house is one that luckily we do still have. Might not recognize it from this illustration, but this is called Hall Place. This was the home of Eli Hall, seen here, who was a local real estate investor and businessman. The house is still there. It's on West Main Street in between Neal Avenue and Linden. It's a really, really beautiful house, Second Empire style. We don't have too many examples of Second Empire architecture really around, so it's interesting to see this one. A really beautiful house. It's got an interesting history. There have been quite a few different organizations associated with it. However, Eli Hall was a really prominent businessman, very well-known person, and he left his mark on Newark, specifically through the buildings that he built. So the building on the left is still standing downtown. It's the Hall building. It most recently was known as being the downtown location for Chase Bank. There are still quite a few things in there in that building. For a long time, it was King's Department Store in downtown Newark. The building has had a few renovations, so it looks pretty different than it does in this photo. But he built this building. And an interesting thing about it is that that building is made out of poured concrete, which in 1909, 1910, when it was built, that was quite a revolutionary style of construction. So not only did he build this building, here's a photo of it more recently, but he built several houses as well. So in the illustration that we saw in the beginning, there was a beautiful property. It looks like there's actually, I believe the house was built in the center of a mound, a circular mound. But he decided to develop the land around him, as would anyone if they were sitting on some really desirable real estate. So he used this method of poured concrete to make these houses. So a colleague of Thomas Edison, and it's often quite misconstrued to say, a lot of people have claimed over the years that Thomas Edison actually was a close friend of Eli Hall and that Thomas Edison designed this method. But actually what I found in my research is that it wasn't Thomas Edison, it was someone who had worked with Thomas Edison. And as was often the case, a lot of the inventions that Edison is credited with weren't actually invented by him, but by his colleagues that worked for him. And he took the credit for them. So this was a style of building. The person who designed this method, they used large metal molds, essentially, that could be rearranged and reconfigured to make the different rooms of the house. And then the concrete would be poured into them. So that's what they did to build quite a number of houses on each side of Eli Hall's home. Here's a couple of them, but these homes are all up and down Neal Avenue and Linden. They all look pretty similar, and they're all made out of poured concrete. Let's move on to the next one. Like I said, I'm gonna have to move through these a little quickly. So this is the home of the Everett family, Edward Hamlin Everett. He was a really influential local man. He was the owner of the American Bottle Company. which is the predecessor to Owens Corning now. It was bought out, but it was on the site of Owens Corning. And they made bottles and glass jars and glass things, but predominantly bottles. They were at one point in time the world's largest bottle manufacturer. Everett was important, not just here in Newark, but he was a high roller nationally known. He had a house in Washington, D.C., which is now the Turkish embassy. He had a very large, very fancy house in Vermont, which is now a university. And I read that he also owned a castle, I think in Bavaria or in Austria. I don't remember exactly where. I think it was in Bavaria. So he was a really important person nationally, very, very well known, very wealthy. This was his home in Newark, a very unique and really interesting house. This was on the corner of Everett and Buena Vista. Here's another photo of it. You can see it was made up of all these sort of octagons. Really interesting style of house. It's important for a couple of reasons, not only because it was where he lived, he was such an important businessman, but also because of what he did with it. So he ended up donating this house to the hospital. His daughter, Amy, had become very involved with the city hospital and in its efforts to build a new hospital building. The original hospital, which is still standing, was over, it's now on Wyoming Street, the house that it was in, over off of Hudson Avenue. But the city had grown to the point where that house that the hospital occupied was not fitting their needs at all. So Everett ended up donating this house along with the property, some money, and I believe stock in the American Bottle Company to the hospital. And they built on. So here you can see originally the house served as sort of a wing of the hospital. I had heard or read that it possibly had housed nurses, I think, when it was connected at this point. And then later that part, the house was demolished and a new wing of the hospital was built, which again, I think had something to do with nurses, or the nursing school was there. So here you can see this was the city hospital. So this hospital, I believe Everett gave the property in 1914, and this hospital opened in 1916 and stood there for 50 years until 1966, when the current hospital opened. I like to call these houses the big three. I'm sure you'll recognize them. These are on Hudson Avenue. They are the Swisher Mansion, the Fleek Mansion, and the Miller Mansion, all still there, all three of them. Let's talk about the Fleek Mansion. This is actually called Ingleside, this house, and it was built by Henry Sherwood Fleek in 1890. It's practically unchanged from then. It's still in really excellent condition. Fleek was a dry goods entrepreneur. His father had operated a dry goods store, and at the time that the business closed, it had been open for 92 years, which was, I think, in the 1950s. And it was one of Newark's longest running businesses. So the Fleek family was very successful. This is Henry Sherwood Fleek. Here's a photo of the house now. As you can see, it's really a beautiful house. It's on Hudson Avenue on the corner of Hudson and Elizabeth. And it was on the market a couple of years ago. So I always like to look at real estate listings. Sometimes these historic homes come up for sale, so you can see pictures of the inside of them. The next one of the big three, this is the Swisher Mansion. It was one of actually two Swisher Mansions in Newark. This one, though, was the home of Harry Swisher. Swisher's brother actually was the inspiration for this house because he built his own house, John Swisher. This was located just a little bit south. This was on 3rd Street, just south of Locust. For actually the majority of this home's existence, it housed the Elks. And the Elks are still in this location. This house was demolished in 1992 to make way for a new building for the Elks. As you can see on the back, there is the gymnasium that they still have. It was built onto the back of this house but the front part was demolished and they built the building that was there now. As I said, though, John built this building first, and it inspired Harry to build his similar style. If I go back, similar colors, not quite identical, but you can see there's some clear inspiration. Now, the Swishers are important because they started a company which is still around. Well, they didn't start it, but they ran a company that was still around. Actually, their father, they inherited it from their father, who I believe received it to settle a debt. And that company is Swisher Sweets, the cigar manufacturer. It's still around, not located in Newark anymore. John Swisher moved to Jacksonville, Florida, which is where the company relocated to. This is a drawing of their downtown cigar manufacturing location, which is also still standing. It just looks quite different now. It is this pharmacy, no longer Aaronsburg Pharmacy anymore. I forget what it's actually called now, but it's on West Main Street. So you can still go see the Swisher Sweets factory when it was in Newark. It moved to Jacksonville, I think, in 1921, which is where it still is now. And the third in that original big three that I mentioned, this is the William Miller House. William C. Miller was a local businessman. He was involved he had a dry goods store and then became involved in the Powers Miller department store, which was actually the reason for the construction of the Union Block, which I mentioned earlier, which is where 31 West is now. Here's a photo of the house today. And the Miller family were prominent. Mrs. Miller, Alice, was actually the sister of Henry Sherwood Fleet, who lived in the house that we were just looking at. And the Miller family were, again, very well known. This house was designed by architect Frank Packard, who designed a few other buildings around Newark. He designed John J. Carroll's house. He designed Clarence White's house. And he designed the renovation of something that we'll look at here in just a second. So I want to include things that are sort of elsewhere in Licking County as well. So I did throw in some additional houses that are in the Granville area. You might have seen me do a presentation similar to this before in person, but I wanted to sort of expand, make it not just Newark. So this house that we're looking at, this is Bryn Mawr. This was built in 1853 by Elias Fassett. It's on 37 just south of Granville. And Elias Fassett was a real estate investor, and he was responsible for, I think it's the Central Ohio Railroad, and it runs from Columbus toward Newark, south of Granville. And actually, he's responsible for a little town, grew up in Heilsburg. Now that area is known as Union Station, because that was the main station that served Granville. He built this house so that he could see his railroad. It's just a little bit north of there, and you can see there's a cupola on the top where he could see the trains coming on his railroad and observe it. Originally, the house sat on 375 acres of land, which he acquired in 1832. After Elias Fassett lived in the house, it was sold to John Hughes in 1890. He was from Wales, and Hughes was actually the one who was responsible for naming it Bryn Mawr, which means high hill in Welsh. Later, the house was purchased by the congregation of the Third Order of St. Francis of Mary Immaculate in Joliet, Illinois in 1931, and they ended up creating a school. It was established as the Granville Mission on the Feast of the Assumption in 1931. And the chapel was dedicated to Our Lady of Mercy on September 16th of 1931. The school was called Our Lady of Mercy, and it opened in 1932 to students, but ended up closing in 1958. Afterwards, it became a nursing home, and then was very famously a restaurant for a long time. So many of you might remember it when it was a restaurant. Now it's a private residence, and I believe they also do events and things. Here you can see where the house that's in the red circle, and then Union Station. So close enough where Elias could look and see the trains coming. Eventually, the tall portico was built on the front, which is still there. And here's a picture. Sorry for the quality of this. I had to take it out of the newspaper. So it's a little sort of double, but it gives you an idea of what the house looks like. Because today, if you drive past, some beautiful landscaping, but it obscures the house a little bit. But it is still there, quite nice. And this is a house that I'm sure we're all familiar with, but not in its presence, not in how it looks like this. This house, Mccune's Villa, also sometimes called Mcune's Folly, or Fort Hill. This was what is now known as Brendue, or Brundee, if we're being a little bit more specific to its pronunciation, I guess. I don't speak Welsh, so I won't claim to say it right. But this was built in 1865 by Henry D. Wright. Originally, it was built as an Italian villa at the base of what was known as Fort Hill. So there used to be a circular earthwork enclosure that they called the Old Fort, or the fort. They assumed that the circular nature of it meant that it was a fort. So that's why this was called Fort Hill Farm, named for that feature. Mccune ended up selling, he moved to Kansas, sold the property to the Cole family and later the Berkey family. The Berkeys began renovating the home, and they added a second floor solarium to the south side of the central tower. But in 1905, the property was purchased by John Sutphen Jones. This is an actual photo of the house, so you can see what it looked like before some extensive renovations. Jones was a very, very successful man. He was a coal and railroad magnate, and he commissioned Frank Packard, who was the man who designed the Miller House, to enlarge the home and completely transform it. So they took it from an Italian villa to sort of a, here is actually John Sutphen Jones, took it from an Italian villa to its current sort of Georgian-inspired classical, sort of a little mixture of styles, but into its present appearance. So this is a modern photo of it, of course, from how it looks today. But as you can see, quite different from what it originally looked like. This house was known far and wide for being important. Really, really famous people came through these doors. John Sutphen Jones' daughter, Sally Jones Sexton, lived in Brendue until the 1970s, and she ran in some very high-profile circles. And there are quite a number of really interesting stories that I've read, and just some of the experiences that she had and the people that came to this house. So she was really well known, not just locally, but she had some very famous, very high-profile acquaintances and friends. So this house has had quite a life. And she was also quite involved in horses. And here is actually a photo of her. So it's appropriate that today the front lawn serves as a polo field. So if you drive by now, it sits quite far from the road, and there is a really beautiful lawn where they do all sorts of things on front, including polo. And it is now operated by a nonprofit, and it's used for events. And there are a lot of other educational things that happen in the buildings, lots of art programming and really wonderful things for the community that take place here. So we are a little bit over on my time. So I do apologize for keeping you extra long, but I appreciate your patience. As I said in the beginning, some of the information that I included needed to be a little bit more brief than I would have personally preferred for all of these, but in order to get them in, sort of had to condense it to the overview. Let me go ahead, actually, I'll turn my camera on so you guys can see me again. So again, I just want to say thank you so much for participating in this talk. My email address and my phone number are both on the screen. So if you have questions that I didn't get to, I think I caught everybody's questions in the chat. But if you had a question that I didn't address, or if you think of something else, or you were interested please feel free to send me an email or give me a phone call. Again, I don't think I mentioned this before. This presentation has been recorded as well. So we will be posting this to our YouTube channel. And generally we share the link on Facebook and across our social media. So please keep an eye out for that. If you really want to rewatch it again, we'll be able to. And if you have friends or family who weren't able to join, you can send them the link. Again, we'll post it, but it will also be on our YouTube channel so that you can watch it again. Someone did ask, how did they move so many houses back in the day? It was really common, actually. And one of the ideas of presentations that I've had for a long time is to actually talk about only houses that were moved because there were a lot. And they do still move houses today. There are houses that have been moved within the last 20 to 30 years. It's still done. It's very expensive, but they really did a lot of moving houses back then, especially in Granville. There are tons of houses that were moved. And if you think about it, resources were a little bit more scarce than they are now, only because they didn't have trucks that were hauling all kinds of stuff. They didn't have the infrastructure to be able to ship lumber and supplies from one side of the country to the other like we do now. Nowadays, when you build a house, the wood was grown probably 2,000 miles from where you actually are. In some instances, it could be. So back then, that wasn't the case. They were building with local materials, and a lot of the stuff had to be locally sourced. So it didn't make sense to tear down something if you didn't have to. Just because you wanted to put another building in that spot, that would have been a waste of the resources of that house. So they actually moved them quite a bit throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. Of course, as we get to the mid 20th century with like the Sherwood Davidson House or the Buckingham House, they were moved specifically to preserve them for their historic value. But a lot of times it was done just quite out of a practical need. Now, in terms of the engineering that goes behind it, that is not my expertise to be able to explain how that's possible. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around it as well, just to know how they even figured that out. So it really goes to show how ingenuitive a lot of people were back then, and the skills that they had were just really incredible. But that's a topic that I've been interested in for a long time and been thinking about presenting on. So great point bringing that up. If anybody else has any questions, you can continue to type them in the chat box. Again, I appreciate all of your positive feedback. Keep an eye out on our social media, on Facebook, Instagram, as well as our website, which is attheworks.org, because we've been doing a lot of really wonderful programming throughout the last year that you can take part in from your home. Not only the history at home presentations, but also side at home. We've been doing works at home, activity kits, all sorts of things to keep you involved. So keep an eye out for that. As always, we appreciate your participation and your support of the works. So thank you so much for your patience and your time this evening. And that about wraps it up. Again, if you didn't see all the presentation, you'll be able to see the recorded thing. We will post it to YouTube. So keep an eye out for that link. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I will see you later.